Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
Another famous battle in American history is the Battle of Bunker Hill. That's the first real siege type of battle that we had against the British. And there's a famous painting of that battle by John Trumbull. And John Trumbull's the same man who painted all those huge pictures in the Rotunda of the U.S. Capitol about the American Revolution. But in this painting, the British are literally killing General Warren on the battlefield. They got their bayonets over him, they're stabbing him, and right to the side there's two individuals that are very prominent in the picture that are featured there, and one of them is Lieutenant Grosvenor, who was one of the leaders in the battle. Standing right beside him is a black man, Peter Salem, and nobody ever pays attention. They always watch the guy getting shish kebab by the British with the bayonets. Right. Over here you get these two guys standing side by side, black and white standing side by side. The black man, Peter Salem, is the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. He saved hundreds of American lives that day. He received 14 commendations from different commanders in that battle. He received recognition from the Continental Congress. He received recognition from the state legislature. He's the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. I mean, as the Americans were winning the battle, and they ran out of ammunition, ran out of equipment, and etc., and that was common in the American Revolution. So now the British turn on them, and they're coming after the Americans. They're slaughtering the Americans. And Peter Salem is able to find the British commander and shoot and kill the British commander, and it just stopped the whole British movement. They didn't know what to do. Allowed all the Americans to get back and regroup and get where they could be saved. So he saved hundreds of American lives that day. We never hear about Peter Salem at all. He's a great hero in the Revolution. Another great man that fought in the Revolution, another story of faith, is Lemuel Haynes. He's a black pastor. He pioneered churches across New England, evangelist. When he heard about the battle, he comes to the battle to defend America from the British attack. And when finally we whip the British at Yorktown and kind of call it quits, and they throw up the white flag, he goes back home, goes back to New England, back to his churches. Interesting thing about Pastor Lemuel Haynes, on George Washington's birthday, he would preach a sermon about George Washington, his commander-in-chief with whom he'd served side by side in the American Revolution. We have so many cool stories of black and white serving together, fighting together in the Revolution. And yet what we hear today are the real victim stories, which are there. No question they're there, but that's only a part of American history. So we have another whole part that we rarely deal with, but we used to know this. This is a great example. This is a history book. It's called Services of Colored Americans in the Wars of 1776 and 1812. It's written by an African American named William Nell, and we don't know who he is today. He's the first African American appointed to any post in the federal government. And we're talking back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s here.
When was this published, Dave?
This particular book is published in 1852. He has this book also. This is his bigger book. And this book from William Nell is 1855. And it's called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Now, look at the size of that book. I think that's a fairly thick book. And you look at the lettering on the inside, that's a lot of small print. This is just about the colored patriots. We didn't know there was that much involved. See, this is the kind of history we used to know. It's the kind of history we used to teach. We just don't hear it anymore. One of the richest parts of American history is black history. And yet today, so many of us know so little about it.
In 1856, the Republican Party entered its first presidential election. In that election, the Republican Party issued this, its first party platform. It was a short document. There were only 9 planks in the platform, but significantly, 6 of the 9 planks set forth bold declarations of equality and civil rights for African Americans based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Democratic platform of that year took an opposite position, strongly defending slavery. In fact, it warned,
all efforts of the abolitionists are calculated to lead to the most alarming and dangerous consequences, and all such efforts have an inevitable tendency to diminish the happiness of the people.
Amazingly, according to Democrats in 1856, attempting to end slavery would ruin the happiness of the people. Despite such clear differences, the Republicans lost that election. The next year, 1857, a Democrat-controlled Supreme Court delivered this, the Dred Scott decision, declaring blacks were not persons or citizens, but instead were property and therefore had no rights. In fact, quoting from this infamous decision, Democrats on the court announced that blacks
had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
In the 1860 presidential election, Republican Abraham Lincoln ran against Democrat U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Both parties again issued platforms. The Republican platform of 1860 blasted both the fugitive slave law and the Dred Scott decision, and it announced its continued intent to end slavery and secure equal civil rights for black Americans. On the other hand, the Democrats in their 1860 platform praised both the fugitive slave law and the Dred Scott decision. In fact, Democrats even handed out copies of the Dred Scott decision along with their platform to affirm their belief that it was proper to have slavery and to hold African Americans in bondage. It is worth noting that for over a century and a half, Democrats often have taken a position that some human life is disposable, as they did in the Dred Scott decision. In that instance, a black individual was not a life, it was property, and you could do with your property as you wished. Today, Democrats have largely taken that same position on unborn human life, that an unborn human is really just disposable property to do with as one wishes. African Americans were the victims of this disposable property ideology a century and a half ago and still are today. Consider, although only 12% of the current population is African American, almost 35% of all abortions are performed on African Americans. In fact, over the last decade, for every 100 African American live births, there were 53 abortions of African American babies. Democrats have encouraged this. In fact, congressional Democrats are almost rabidly pro-abortion, and they consistently vote against protections for innocent unborn human life. For over a century and a half, Democrats have wrongly argued that some human life is merely disposable personal property, and black Americans have suffered most under this philosophy.
If you want to move to a different level of great black history, you got to go into the black pastors who had such an impact in the early American era, because you do have Richard Allen, you do have Absalom Jones, but who's ever heard of folks like Andrew Bryant or John Moran or Harry Hoosier or so many others? We don't hear those names today, but they had huge impact. Matter of fact, Harry Hoosier was considered the greatest preacher in the First Great Awakening. Now, in the Great Awakening, we hear folks like Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield or whatever. Don't hear about Harry Hoosier. He's a black preacher. Benjamin Rush signed the Declaration, said he was the greatest preacher of any of them. So you have Bishop Asbury, Bishop Cope. You have this black preacher in the First Great Awakening that draws larger crowds than Bishop Asbury, Bishop Coke, all the other famous preachers in the First Great Awakening. Nobody hears his name. But if you think about Harry Hoosier, you go, Hoosier, that's a familiar sounding name. Oh yeah, the Indiana Hoosiers? Named after Harry Hoosier.
Wow.
We don't know that today. We don't hear a thing about that. And without the First Great Awakening, there is no independent America. I mean, Founding Fathers said that, John Adams said that, Benjamin Franklin said that. Well, who's a great leader in the First Great Awakening? Harry Hoosier. There are great black preachers, great heroes, great inspirational heroes. We have great military heroes, but they tended to be Christians. So we hear very little about the wholesome stories. We hear very little about the Christian stories. But let me tell you, one of the richest parts of America's history is what has happened with black Americans in American history.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.